The next call was a split call. Gareth Hughes, 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui, kia koutou, kia ora. Mr. Speaker, I heard a lot of housing from the member Jamie Lee Ross, but it's a house of cards that the government's building, and they can't seem to get it right. In fact, it's like they're building this house on the sand foundation, because look, there's hardly any houses being built. The land the government's, going around showing off isn't actually the government's land. We're talking about exploding substations, Mr. Speaker. Now today we've seen the minister disappear into the black blocs, but I'm sure he'll be happy that he's got Jamie Lee Ross defending him. Mr. Speaker, we face a housing crisis. We heard from the member that things are getting better in the budget for young New Zealand families. It's not. In fact, what's happened is a whole new term has been coined for what's facing the current generation, which is generation rent. We're seeing a whole generation locked out of the dream of home ownership. In fact, for them it is only a dream. We're seeing in Auckland at the moment capital gains per annum greater than the average annual salary. Mr. Speaker, something is wrong in New Zealand when we see such a pervasive housing crisis happening in a bigger city. You see the the Reserve Bank cutting interest rate because of the slowdown and the rest of the economy. So sure, the government did a few good things in the budget. It's hard to remember them, Mr. Speaker, and the national members have spent more time talking about the New Zealand First and the Labour parties than what they achieved in the budget. But I'll take my hat off and say that it was good to see beneficiaries actually get some additional funding. It had been too long. So it was right. Obviously, the way it's being implemented with the abatement costs, we'll see a lot of people getting a lot less than the $25 a week, but it is good to see beneficiaries not just being harangued, but also getting some good support. But Mr. Speaker, what we have seen in the wake of the budget is the country's facing some serious structural economic problems. This has been highlighted. Once upon a time it was talked about a rock star economy, but we're seeing those serious structural economic problems. You see it in the price of milk, and you see the impact that's having on the economy. Now, Jamie Lee Ross was triumphantly talking about debt. Mr. Speaker, the last time I looked, our net overseas debt position was in the same ballpark of some of the European countries having serious problems. When I looked into it early in the year, we were spending $7.7 billion a year just on interest payments flowing offshore. So we've seen a dependence on dairy, which when those low price commodities plummet, has serious national impacts. We're seeing it with the lack of the surplus. Now, it wasn't the opposition benches who made a mountain out of the surplus idea. In fact, it was Bill English himself. He set this as the exemplar of what he was aiming for, and 7 deficits in a row. Obviously, there's also the deficit of ideas, the deficit of innovation, because we're seeing real problems come through. Now, what we haven't heard about is the growing inequality. We've seen a small measure, which in real terms won't have a significant impact for beneficiary families, but we've seen fantastic high inequality. The OECD estimate inequality rates at the moment have slashed 10% off our GDP. And when you look at, say, the mid-90s, the average CEO was getting about 15 times the average wage. Now it's 119, according to the economist Susan St. John. It's having a real economic impact, it's having a real social impact, and we also see the generational inequality. We've seen it in housing, but Mr. Speaker, for many older members of this House who grew up in a different New Zealand, free education, an affordable home, good job, they were considered the norms. Mr. Speaker, for my generation and Jamie Lee Ross's generation, they're considered luxuries now. So we see a surplus of inequality, a surplus of generational inequality, and a surplus of emissions. Because what the budget did contain was additional subsidies for fossil fuels. Despite all the work the government's doing, railing against them internationally, we saw a tiny increase in research and development funding, but not enough to even move us from where we are, which is in the bottom half of the OECD. We have a serious innovation problem. Just today, a new report's come out in Australia warning they could be losing 5 million jobs over the coming decades because of automation and other global challenges. These are where we need to be addressing some of the structural challenges facing our economy, and the answers are in terms of innovation, investing in our universities and tertiary education, investing in research and development in science, investing in smart green technology like clean energy, and that's what the Greens have advocated for an awful long time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.